All right, so get ready for this. Today's deep dive, well, it's going to take us into the world of business ethics, but with a bit of a twist. We're not talking about like the usual, buzzwords or like those corporate social responsibility reports you see everywhere. We're
Wow.
going way, way back.
Yeah.
Ancient wisdom,
hmm
Leviticus chapters 17 through 20.
You might be thinking, hold on, what does the Old Testament have to do with, running a business now, like in the 21st century? And honestly, that's a fair question to ask.
I know, right? It seems like such an odd pairing, which is honestly what got me interested in the first place. I mean, could these old ancient texts really offer practical insights for entrepreneurs today?
Well, that's what we're here to figure out. What I find fascinating is that these chapters, well, yeah, they're rooted in a very specific cultural and historical context. They actually lay out some pretty universal, ethical principles. We're talking justice, respect for life, loyalty, integrity, and how these concepts play out in relationships.
Okay, so those are definitely themes that still resonate even today. But how do they actually connect to like the nuts and bolts of actually running a business?
Right.
Let's start with Leviticus 17. What's the core teaching there and how does it apply to entrepreneurs, would you say?
Well, Leviticus 17, it starts off with a very powerful symbol, blood.
Hmm.
In this context, blood represents life itself, which is considered sacred. And this emphasis on the sanctity of life sets the stage for like a whole system of ethics.
Interesting. So
Huh.
how does this translate to a business context? Are we talking about like workplace safety protocols here?
Well, safety is definitely a part of it,
Hmm.
but it goes deeper than that. It's about, recognizing the inherent value of every single person who is involved in your business. So your employees, your customers, even the community where you operate.
So it's less about don't spill blood and more about valuing the people whose blood, sweat, and tears go into making a business work, so to speak.
It's exactly. The podcast episode we're diving into today gives this example of um, companies that are prioritizing their employees' mental health and well-being. They're investing in things like counseling services,
Mhm.
stress reduction programs, and creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking openly about these issues.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly pushing employees to their breaking point, are you really respecting the sanctity of life? It's not just about preventing physical harm. It's about creating an environment where people can thrive.
And it's interesting, there's a strong business case to be made for this kind of approach. Studies actually show that employees who feel valued and supported are more engaged, they're more productive, and more loyal.
Right. So it's not just about being nice. It's a smart business strategy, too. It makes me wonder, how can companies take this idea of valuing life even further? What are some other ways they can demonstrate this commitment beyond just mental health initiatives?
That's a great question, and it's something we can definitely continue to explore as we move through the other chapters. But before we do that, let's shift gears over to Leviticus 18, where the focus is on loyalty and integrity in relationships.
Okay, so we're moving from the big picture concept of valuing life to how we interact with each other in a business setting.
Precisely. Leviticus 18 is all about honesty, trustworthiness, keeping your promises, basically building a foundation of integrity in all your dealings.
That sounds pretty straightforward, but I imagine it can get, complicated in the real world of business.
Absolutely. And this is where things start to get really interesting because there are so many gray areas and ethical dilemmas that can come up. For example, what happens when you're faced with a competitor who is engaging in some shady practices? Do you play by their rules just to stay competitive, or do you stick to your principles even if it means potentially losing out?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It's easy to talk about integrity in the abstract, but when your bottom line is on the line, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right. And that's why it's so important to have a strong ethical framework in place before you find yourself in those high-pressure situations. Leviticus 18 encourages us to be proactive, not reactive, when it comes to building integrity.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, the podcast episode highlights this really interesting trend. CEOs who practice what they call radical honesty. They're completely transparent with their teams about even their own mistakes and shortcomings. And the idea is that this vulnerability actually fosters a culture of trust and what they call psychological safety, where people feel comfortable taking risks and admitting when they need help.
Radical honesty. It sounds almost counterintuitive in a world where, like, everyone's trying to present their best selves. I can see how it could backfire if it's not done authentically.
It definitely takes a certain level of self-awareness and skill to pull it off. But the companies that are doing it well are seeing some pretty remarkable results. They're attracting top talent, building stronger relationships with their customers, and creating a more resilient and adaptable work culture.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly ancient principles can be applied to modern challenges in a really powerful way. It's making me rethink some of my own assumptions about how business is done.
And we're just scratching the surface. As we move into Leviticus 19, we'll see how these ideas of integrity and loyalty connect to a broader concept of justice and equity.
Okay, so we've talked about valuing life and building integrity. What's next on our Leviticus leadership tour?
Well, Leviticus 19 takes us into the realm of justice and equity, which might be the most challenging principle to apply in today's business world, I'd say.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, business is often seen as this competitive game where the goal is, to win, even if it means someone else loses. How does the concept of justice fit into that kind of paradigm?
It challenges that paradigm itself, really. Leviticus 19 calls for fairness, impartiality, and a deep respect for the rights and dignity of everyone involved. It's about creating a level playing field, both within your own company and also in your dealings with, the outside world.
So we're not just talking about playing fair with our competitors. We're also talking about how we treat our employees, our suppliers, our customers, everyone in our ecosystem.
Exactly. And this is where things can get really tricky because the modern business world is full of, power imbalances and systemic inequalities. Take the issue of fair wages, for example. Leviticus 19 would argue that it's not enough to simply pay the minimum wage that's required by law. You have a moral obligation to pay a living wage that allows your employees to thrive, not just survive.
That's a pretty radical idea in today's economy, where profit margins are often so thin and companies are constantly being pressured to cut costs. Are there any real world examples of businesses actually putting this principle into practice?
There are. And they're often the ones who are leading the way in terms of both social impact and financial success. The podcast episode mentions Patagonia again, which is a great example of a company that has built its entire brand around, ethical and sustainable practices. They pay their employees fair wages, they source their materials responsibly, and they're, constantly pushing the boundaries of what it means to be a socially responsible business.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It seems like the companies that take these ancient principles seriously are often the ones that are also innovating and thriving. It's like doing the right thing is actually good for business.
Right, and it makes you wonder, why aren't more businesses adopting this kind of approach? What are the barriers that are preventing them from embracing these ethical values?
I guess there's the fear of losing out to competitors who are cutting corners, and also the pressure from investors to prioritize those short-term profits over long-term sustainability.
Those are definitely real challenges, and it takes a lot of courage and conviction to kind of resist them. But I think there's also this growing awareness that the old way of doing business, the win-at-all-costs mentality, it's just not sustainable in the long run.
Consumers are becoming more discerning and they're voting with their wallets.
Yeah.
They want to support businesses that align with their values, even if it means paying a little bit more.
And employees are demanding more from their employers, too. They want to work for companies that treat them fairly, that give them a sense of purpose, and that are making a positive impact on the world.
It's like we're at this tipping point where ethical considerations are no longer just nice to have. They're actually becoming a core part of what it means to be a successful business in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see this shift happening. And I think Leviticus offers a really valuable framework for navigating this new landscape. But there's one more principle we need to explore: respect for norms and traditions, which is the focus of Leviticus 20.
Okay, so now we're talking about respecting the rules. That sounds a little, a little less exciting than, revolutionizing the business world with radical honesty and fair trade practices. How does this fit into our conversation about ethical leadership?
It might seem like a contradiction at first, respecting tradition in a world that's constantly changing and innovating. But I actually think it's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
I'm all ears. Explain this one to me.
Okay, well, think about it this way. Norms and traditions, they actually represent the accumulated wisdom of generations past.
Yeah.
They're like the guardrails that help us navigate these complex situations and make sound decisions. They provide a sense of stability and continuity in a world that can often feel really chaotic and unpredictable.
So it's not about blindly following the rules. It's about understanding the underlying values that they represent and applying them in a way that makes sense for the modern world.
Exactly. And this is where that tension between innovation and tradition comes into play. Startups, for example, they're often disrupting entire industries and challenging the status quo. But the most successful ones are those that find a way to balance their groundbreaking ideas with a healthy respect for the existing norms and regulations.
That makes sense. If you come in like guns blazing and disregard all the rules, you're likely to alienate potential customers and partners and ultimately create more problems than you solve.
The podcast episode gives the example of companies that are uh, navigating the really complex world of data privacy. It's a very rapidly evolving landscape with new technologies emerging all the time, but there are certain fundamental principles that need to be upheld, like transparency, consent, and user control.
It's like finding that sweet spot, pushing the boundaries of what's possible while still operating within an ethical framework that protects people and builds trust.
And it's not always easy to find that balance. It requires a lot of careful consideration, open communication, and a willingness to adapt as the world changes around us.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the sanctity of life to the importance of justice and equity, from radical honesty to respecting tradition. It's amazing to see how these ancient principles from Leviticus can be applied to such a wide range of modern business
It
challenges.
really speaks to the timelessness of these ethical ideas. They may have been written thousands of years ago, but they're just as relevant today as they were back then.
But let's get real. It's one thing to understand these principles in theory. It's another thing to actually put them into practice. How can our listeners take what we've discussed today and translate it into action?
That's the million-dollar question.
Hmm.
And it's something we'll explore in more detail in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've explored these four powerful principles from Leviticus: valuing life, building integrity, pursuing justice, and respecting tradition. But the big question is, how do we actually live these principles in the day-to-day reality of running a business?
It starts with self-awareness, I think. Before you can lead others ethically, you need to kind of understand your own values and your own motivations. What do you believe in? What are your non-negotiables? What kind of impact do you want to make on the world?
So it's about defining your own personal compass before you start navigating the complex terrain of the business world.
Exactly. It's about creating a framework for decision making that's grounded in your core values, not just what's expedient or profitable in the short term. Once you have that foundation in place, then you can start to build a company culture that reflects those same principles.
I imagine that's easier said than done. How do you actually translate those values into concrete actions and policies?
It's an ongoing process for sure, and there's no one size fits all answer. But one thing that I think is crucial is to create space for open and honest dialogue.
Yeah.
Encourage your employees to share their perspectives, even if they're different from your own. Be willing to challenge your own assumptions and to make adjustments as you go.
That sounds like it requires a lot of humility, especially for leaders who are used to, being in charge and making the calls.
Humility is essential, really. Ethical leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to learn and grow, to admit when you're wrong, and to course correct when necessary. It's about recognizing that you're part of a larger ecosystem, and that your decisions impact not just your own company, but the wider community and the world around you as well.
It's like that saying, the true test of leadership is how you behave when no one is watching. It's about making the ethical choice even when it's difficult or unpopular.
And that can be incredibly challenging, especially in a business environment where there's often this pressure to prioritize profits over principles. But I think the companies that are truly succeeding in the long run, they're the ones that are finding a way to balance to balance both.
The ones who are proving that you can do well by doing good, it's like those two things aren't mutually exclusive. They're actually interconnected.
Right. When you treat your employees fairly, when you create products that are genuinely beneficial, when you operate with transparency and integrity, you build trust with your customers, your partners, and your employees. And that trust is invaluable. It's really the foundation of a sustainable and successful business.
So it's not just about avoiding scandals or staying out of legal trouble. It's about building a business that's aligned with your values, and that makes a positive contribution to the world.
And that, I think, is the most inspiring takeaway from our deep dive into Leviticus. These ancient texts offer this timeless reminder that business can be a force for good, a way to create value, not just for ourselves, but for others as well.
It's a powerful message, and one that I think really resonates with a lot of people who are, looking for more meaning and purpose in their work. It's like we're all kind of searching for that sweet spot where we can combine our passion with our principles and make a real difference.
And I think the more we can have these conversations, the more we can share stories of businesses that are doing it right, the more momentum we can build towards creating a more ethical and sustainable business world.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's like the one piece of advice you would give to our listeners, who are on their own entrepreneurial journeys?
Well, I would say don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. And most importantly, don't be afraid to lead with your values.
That's a powerful call to action, and I think it's a fitting end to our exploration of Leviticus and its surprising relevance for modern business. So, to our listeners, we leave you with this challenge. How will you apply these ancient principles to your own work and life? What
Yeah.
kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? Those are the questions worth, pondering as you continue on your own journey.
Indeed. It's been a fascinating deep dive, and I hope it sparks
Entrepreneur.
further reflection and action for everyone listening.